All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first Law Trades workshop, What First-Time GCs Need to Know. It looks like we have an amazing turnout, and I'm seeing a bunch of familiar names here, so hello, everybody. We want to keep this interactive, so feel free if you'd like to drop in the chat where you're zooming in from. You can also turn on your video if you'd like. And we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A button at any time during the event, and we will try our best to get to the best ones. For those who haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Rod Ahmed, and I am the CEO of a legal tech startup called Law Trades, where we help busy GCs source, interview, and hire from a vetted network of flexible legal talent to help manage work spikes and build a high-performing remote legal team. In turn, we help lawyers around the world become independent and earn a passive income doing what they love in their own terms. So, without further ado, I'd love to introduce our wonderful host for this workshop, Hank Greenberg, General Counsel of Oscar Health, a company utilizing technology, design, and data to humanize healthcare. Hank graduated from Harvard Law in 2011, clerked for the US Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, and joined Jenner & Block as an associate before diving into the in-house world. His experience spans across working with public companies, IPOs, regulatory counseling, building amazing legal teams, and much, much more, as we'll soon discover. Hank, thank you so much for leading our workshop for today. I'll pass the mic over to you now to kick things off.
Great. Well, Rod, thanks very much. And thanks to the entire Law Trades team, you and Hannah especially, for putting this together. To plug you guys, what you're doing is really exciting. It's a great resource for in-house legal teams, great product. So couldn't recommend you guys highly enough. So look, I'm really excited to be here. And as Rod mentioned, I hope that we can make this as interactive as we can possibly do it through the Q&A. So as questions come up, please send them along, and we budgeted some time to be able to run through them. There's a great diversity of attendees here, GCs, assistant GCs, partners, associates at law firms. I know I'm going to take away a lot just from hearing your questions, and I hope that everyone here will get a little bit out of this, regardless of where you are in your career or what practice setting you inhabit now. So what you're looking at now on the index slide is where we're going to go over the next hour. And I wanted to put these up just to illustrate some of the key topics here, but I also want to emphasize that these aren't really discrete categories. There's lots of connections among these, and there's overlap. And as we go through them, you'll see that some of the planks here, understanding the business, defining your agenda, these things link up and they talk to each other. And so this is a really complex topic, and there's a lot of different ways of doing it. And so we'll get into all of the heart of that in just a minute. So to segue into the next slide, I just want to preview a little bit and talk about what to expect and what this is and what it isn't, to focus our presentation a little bit. So first of all, it's not how to get a GC job. It's not how to be a good in-house lawyer, although certainly a lot of the content is going to feed into those types of issues. It's really about how to build a model for how to do the GC job. And one key caveat for all of this is that there is no one size fits all. I think it really depends on your client, and you got to know your client. You got to know your leadership team. Lots of flex in how the job is done comes from the expectations of the client, the personalities, the gaps in the skills and knowledge of the leadership team and the company you work for. And so what it means to be successful will and can be very different for GCs depending on where you come from. And GCs in a company where you're the lone lawyer have a very different set of challenges than GCs that in a bigger company where you might have a large legal team underneath you. So I want to focus on what's common across all of these jobs. And what we're going to talk about are ideas, skills, principles that I think are common across every practice setting in-house for every company. And they're ideas and skills that take years and years to build and deploy. And I think about these all the time, and I hope to get better at them throughout my career too. So it's not me pontificating about some expert level of proficiency that I have achieved and will never lose. I think these are works in progress all the time. And that's important because this is a hard job. So let's just dive right into the next slide. And I want to start by talking about defining your agenda. And I think this might be the most important insight about the difference between being a GC in a company versus being a lawyer in a company or a lawyer in any practice setting. We all know coming out of law school, and if you've been through a law firm or even as a junior lawyer in-house, your work comes to you. You're going to have senior lawyers come to you and say, I have a project for you, I have an assignment. You might have business clients come to you and say, hey, I have a problem that I need help with. I think the key thing for being a successful GC is reorienting your work style and flipping that on its head. Because much like any senior leader in a company, as a GC, your work can't be driven solely by someone asking you to do something. It has to be driven by what you think is most important for you to be working on and doing day to day, week to week, month to month, and zooming out even quarter to quarter or year to year. Now, there are always going to be exceptions to that. You're always going to have business clients coming to you saying, I need help with this thing and I need the help with this project. And those will derail the things that, for you might be higher priorities up until that moment. But, you really got to think hard in a big picture way about how to spend your time. And if you're just spending your time reacting to work that's coming your way and trying to get things off your desk, then I don't think you're doing the highest value work that a GC should be doing. And this feeds into, as a GC, the way that you budget resources across your team, whether you're a lawyer of one that's managing a budget for outside counsel, or whether you're a GC that manages a big in-house legal department. You will deploy the resources you have according to how you frame your agenda as a leader. And that includes how you spend your time interacting with other people in the company, whether you want to try to get more face time with senior leaders in your company, whether you want to dive in and spend more time with a certain product team, or whether you want to be really defensive and say, I know you want me at this meeting, but it's just, it's not something I can spend time on right now, based on what I know the key risks in the company are. And I use the word risk there, and I want to really emphasize that. In developing a system to ferret out the best and highest uses of your time and defining an agenda that attacks those, my suggestion is to think about company risk as the framework. And this is what I think about every single day of the week. How you spend your time has to connect up to the risks of the business. And that includes regulatory and legal risk, but it also includes execution risk, operational risk. It includes all of the risks that your CEO, your CFO are thinking about. And if you see a major risk inside the company that falls into any one of those categories or others, then that light bulb should go off, and that should tell you that you should be attacking it. You should be able to use your voice as a GC, and we'll talk about this later, to highlight that risk, to engage the right people, to catalyze action around it. And so the way I generally think about how I'm going to spend my time and where I'm going to allocate my resources is around, where are the things that in this company could derail our major priorities from a strategic level on down. And that might not really seem obvious to junior lawyers on my team or other people inside the company. But, if I know the business really well, and if I'm reading the temperature of the leadership team, and if I'm hearing what our board cares about, then I'm going to be really plugged in, even if others across the company don't necessarily see that every day. So let's go to the next slide, because I think this is a really good segue here, understanding and facing the business like an owner. I mentioned that you got to have a really strong sense for what the risks are. And to set an agenda based on risks, you have to know them. And to know them, you have to understand your business. And this has become a little bit of a cliche. So, I don't want to sound like, every single article or blog post that you might have seen about this, but, as the GC of the company, you really have to know how and why the business works. And this means the strategy of the company. It means the market. It means where your client fits into the market. And maybe even most importantly, the actual operations of your company. Like how are the teams set up? Who does what? Who's responsible for what? Where are the handoffs? Where do things go wrong? And I think if you can't hold your own in a discussion with the senior leadership team about these subjects, about, are we going to pivot left or are we going to pivot right? Are we going to make this investment or that investment? That I don't think that you're thinking deeply enough about the company to well inform the legal function. And this goes right back to what I mentioned about agenda setting. In order to set that agenda, you have to know where the risks are, and you have to understand the business to know where the risks are. So these things talk to each other. By knowing what the strategic goals of the company are, by knowing what your CEO, your CFO is telling your board about where the company is going and what the priorities are, you will be able then to say, gee, on this particular deal that I'm working on or that my team is working on, I know that this is so critical to our company strategy, because if it doesn't land, then we're not going to be able to hit that quarterly goal that we've set out for ourselves. So as a result, I'm going to be willing to take more risks to get this deal done than I would if it were something that were just ancillary to our development as a company. I think that's a kind of thought process that a GC ought to be engaging in every day. And you ought to be imparting that to lawyers that work with you to deploy that similar framework and help guide their own decision-making about the day-to-day work that they do. And I mentioned knowing the market. I want to talk about a discrete thing that I have had happen to me, and I think is something that's probably happened to a lot of people that are dialing in right now. That goes to this question about knowing the business and knowing the market. And the fact that it's such a bad feeling when it happens tells you how important it is to really, invest time in this development for yourself. One of the worst feelings that I've ever had as a GC giving guidance, or even as an in-house lawyer, is giving my view about a subject and then immediately having the business person, all the way up to the CEO say, well, our two primary competitors actually don't do it that way. They do the opposite, the thing that you're telling me that we can't do or we shouldn't do. Where I've been surprised to learn that our competitors do something different than what we're doing, and I didn't know that. And I think that that's something that we have to be able to know as GCs, and we have to ask questions about what the market does in order to calibrate our own legal guidance. I think my web connection here might be a little bit janky, so I'm going to go to another room where it usually works a little bit better. So I apologize for that. Okay, so we talked about understanding the business, and I want to talk about why the mindset change as a GC when it comes to understanding the business is a really radical one relative to being an in-house lawyer in another context. The way that you use legal analysis as any in-house lawyer very often is as your output. You're doing the research. You're trying to understand what the statutory or regulatory basis for guidance that you're giving is. And then you're using that as the basis for communicating some guidance to a business client. I think as the GC, the legal analysis is really not an output. It's really just an input for a bigger picture risk evaluation or recommendation or guidance that you're giving to your client. And I think when you think about the legal analysis as an input, that forces you to look at a range of different market strategy risks that normally aren't the kinds of things that lawyers are trained to think about. But I think those things are really important to leveling up and being a trusted advisor and being more than kind of just quote unquote a lawyer, which we all hear every day of the week, as a GC you're supposed to be. So if there's one thing that you take home from this, and this is something that I work with my team on all day long, and I push myself to also be better at, it's thinking about the legal analysis and the legal conclusions, not as the end point, but as the starting point for the guidance that you're going to give to your client. So let's go to the next slide, and I'm just going to pause very briefly to see in the Q&A. And we have a question from actually a law school classmate of mine and a good friend of mine about what the tips and tricks are for keeping abreast of what competitors in the market are doing to address or manage certain areas of risk, since that might not always be public. This is a really great question, and I'm going to give you a really, really easy way to do this, which doesn't involve subscribing to expensive databases or scouring 10 pages deep in some trade journal. I think maybe one of the best sources for getting this information are the business people that you're working with themselves, including and especially your sales team. The sales team is a font of immense knowledge about the market. They know what the competitors are doing. They know what the new features are that are going to be rolled out. They know what the middlemen in your market are up to. And they can be really, really powerful people to inform your legal guidance. And I will say that, in virtually every conversation that I have with the sales team at Oscar, I'm usually in question mode when I'm getting questions from them. I want to know what, we're in health insurance. I want to know what the broker community is doing. I want to know what other health insurers do. I want to know which direction the market is moving. I want to know whether, there's a lot of price competition happening in this place, or whether, the carriers are leaving this market. And as a result, the price pressure is going to go the other way. I think that the business people in your company know a lot of stuff that is totally hyper relevant to legal guidance, and asking those questions on the front end is a really powerful way of informing yourself before you, stick your foot in your mouth, which is something that I've done a lot and hope to never do again. But really good question, and I think using the resources that you already have and the free ones is the most powerful way to do it. One person is asking whether we or I interface with lawyers from our competitors, and the questioner is saying that he or she has heard some lawyers doing this, but do we generally discourage it? I think it depends on the nature of what you're talking about, and I think it depends on the sensitivity, and it depends on whether what you're doing is trying to sort of gather information that's going to betray a confidence to your client, or whether it's really something that's just kind of hey, I'm gathering market information. I have, and I wouldn't say I routinely do, talk to lawyers from other health insurers, but I definitely talk to our trade associations. And if you are a member of your trade associations for your industry, they can be really powerful sources of knowledge about this. Oftentimes, they're not going to want to, tell you what someone else from another one of their association members told them. But I think it kind of depends, and I think it can be a powerful set of relationships to develop. I think it can be unusually useful in a situation where there's some commonality of interest across the industry. And it's not a question of kind of squeezing the balloon and, if I get information from you, I'm going to use it against you. More about, hey, we're seeing this thing, we're seeing an uptick in fraud. Are you seeing the same thing? No one likes fraud. No one wants to be defrauded. We all have an obligation to root it out and try to avoid it. And so that's a great example of something where it can be really useful to talk to other, industry peers to take the temperature. So I know my video is freezing a little bit, and I apologize for that. I did a speed check before this and it was working fine, but the internet gods, I guess, are not really cooperating with me today. Rod, I'll just ask you if my audio is okay, because I think folks probably need to hear what I'm saying more than they see my face.
Your audio is perfect, so feel free to keep going, and it just freezes right in the right place when you're speaking, so it kind of looks like you're talking. But yeah, sometimes it's frozen, but don't worry about it. Keep going. This is great.
All right, sorry folks about that. I sincerely apologize. Okay, so I want to talk next about handling the C-suite, which I think is in and of itself, fodder for an hour or 2 hours of presentation here. I think a lot of the stuff that I'm going to go over and that we're already talking about is, plugs directly into this. So like I said, these things all overlap. But I think just a couple of things that I want to talk about that are discrete to this particular question. A CEO that I know once told me, I don't really know what lawyers do. And my response to that, sort of overcoming my initial sort of, reaction, like, oh gosh, like you should really know, is actually good. Like you shouldn't really have to as a CEO, right? I think my goal as a GC is to make decision-making for the C-level of a company as easy as I can. I want to be the one, and I want my team to be the ones in the mines, working out the answer, evaluating the risks. And once I have a view on an issue, I want to be able to convey it without having to make my clients do a lot of work. The how to this is the hardest part. And I think that this is especially challenging when you're coming up in an organization and maybe you've been there for a few years before you get the GC job, or you're coming in fresh and you're kind of an unknown quantity. And I say that because the how is really about building credibility and trust, because the credibility and trust is a substitute for your CEO, your CFO having to test your own logic, your own research, or your own relationship with reality, like being called out for not knowing that our competitors do the very thing that you're telling me that we can't do. And so I think we'll get into this later when we talk about finding your voice, like at the very end. But I think the take home here is that this is a very relationship-driven job. It's not just about being their lawyer. You're not just on call and airdropping in and giving your opinion. they have to know you as a trustworthy person and a person of integrity who has their head screwed on straight. And I think the way you do that is by being really, really good at the legal side of the analysis and delivering guidance that's informed by the market and the company strategy. But it's also just like being a person that's trustworthy and credible around everything. I will get more into this. I think this maybe is one of the most important things for lawyers generally, not just GCs. But I think when it comes to handling all of my easiest interactions are ones where I'm coming at the interaction with the assumption that what I have done is really ferreted out the issue and that I've done the hard work and that I'm internalizing all of the externalities that our company's leadership cares about so that they don't have to pick it apart. Now look, as the GC, you get asked some version of everything. And so, they don't want to talk to your team. They want to talk to you. You're a little bit expected to be a one-stop shop for everything. You're every kind of lawyer rolled into one. But the reality is that you can't be. And your clients don't know what you don't. They don't know what you don't know. So, they just know you as a lawyer. And so I think there are plenty of things that you won't know or you can't answer immediately. And I think that it's really important, and I will get more into this later, to not be self-conscious about not knowing the answer to everything or even admitting that you don't know. And I think that pretending that you do or trying to ad-lib it is more of an abuse of trust than anything else. So I find myself saying more and more often in my career, let me do a little bit of work on that and get back to you. I don't think there's any shame there. I've never gotten in trouble for saying that. I'm going to keep that promise. I'm not going to drop the ball and disappear. But I think more lawyers should say that more often, especially in an in-house environment where the person asking you the question might not know that you're not an employment law expert or that IP isn't what you trained for years doing. We get ambushed a lot. We get asked complex questions as we're walking down the hall. It's okay to say that, I don't know right now. So we'll get a little bit more into that. I really want to talk about that more depth in just a minute at the very end. So I just want to turn to the questions really quickly before we keep going. So there's one question about what the right cadence is for meetings between the GC and the CEO, and what should the purpose of these meetings be? And should they be bi-directional? So I'm going to just sort of take the easy way out here and sort of tell you that it depends, but I will get a little bit more concrete. The reason I can say it depends is that this is a relationship job, and I think you do need some cadence and you do need that FaceTime. And so the answer is certainly not never, or it's certainly not like only as needed, in which case you might only have a meeting with your CEO once every so often or once in a blue moon. I think it also means that as your company grows in size and scope, and as the issues that are more important to you, maybe you're going to go public soon, or maybe you're sort of in a securities fraud situation, or maybe there's just a big product launch that really depends on getting some legal analysis right. That could up the frequency of the cadence because you just have more important stuff to talk about. So there's no right answer or wrong answer. I would just say that you need to be the one that makes that decision, because if you don't make that decision, the decision will get made for you. And I don't think that works out well for the GC. I think you need to be an advocate for the importance of your function at the highest level of the company. And so the answer to the question about what the purpose of the meeting should be is that I think that it's your job to tell the CEO what you think the CEO needs to know about what you're seeing in the company, about risks. You're trying to refocus your CEO's attention, and by proxy, the company's attention, and by proxy, the resources of the company on things that you think are important or not getting the right level of care. This is not about pointing the finger at other leaders. It's nothing like that. It could be as simple as saying, gee, I've been doing a lot of work on, privacy. I've been doing a lot of work on IP, and I really think we could stand to get smarter and better about how we're managing this particular issue. And here's how I want to do it. And I want your buy-in, that's something that you think is a priority. It will necessarily be bidirectional. Because if you're having the right relationship with a CEO, a CFO, anyone in the C-suite, what you should be hearing from them is, I agree with you for the following reasons, or I disagree with you for the following reasons. The reasons will tell you a lot about the strategy of the company. The reasons will tell you a lot about what's inside of your client's head, and that should feed right back in to the risk-based agenda that you have running in your head every day of the week. So another question sort of touched on this. What do you mean by agenda? do you say, hey, I think we have issues with confidentiality, or, like your prices seem to go willy-nilly to anyone and everyone? Or, so do you say your agenda is improving confidentiality? How do you frame it? I think the answer to that is like, yes, that could be it. But I think you want to make it bigger picture, right? Like, I think as a GC, part of what you're trying to do is you're trying to identify discrete issues, and then you're trying to say, well, gee, what's the root cause of that? Why is that happening? Why am I seeing this mistake happening for the second or the third time? I don't think it's necessarily good enough in every situation to just say we have this, we have this discrete problem right here, because you probably could have fixed that at a lower level. I think, and this is hypothetical, but I think it's something more like, I'm noticing that, whenever we have to do this function, we're relying on a manual process. And as a result, it's throwing off some regulatory problems that I'm seeing happen over and over again. And if we don't do something about it, we're going to end up getting in hot water with a regulator, or we're going to get fined, or something like that. Here's how I want to address it. I think you need to take it up a level when you're talking to the CEO. As for the agenda itself, no right or no wrong way to do it. I think the agenda is, what are the big risks of the company? If you're a company that sells, a product and your brand is entirely based on confidentiality of your customers' information, and a breach of that trust would really hamper your company's ability to sell, that's a big risk. That's a really big one. That might be way bigger than, a B2B product where confidentiality of personal information is not really the currency of what you're selling. So, again, it depends, but as long as you're thinking about it, I think that's the real important first step. So let's keep moving. I want to go to the next slide because I just want to make sure that we cover everything, but we'll get to more of the questions as these as we get the questions in. So I want to talk about being a paid skeptic, which is a term that I borrowed from a CFO that I've worked with. And I just really love this concept, so I'm gonna, take it and run away with it. I think one of the highest value uses of a general counsel's time is testing others' ideas and conclusions, especially when you're working with other lawyers. I think it's dangerous, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but I think it can be dangerous to rely wholesale on the advice of outside counsel or other lawyers without understanding and testing that rationale, without feeding it through that thought process that pulls in the data that I mentioned, that calibrates it against the risks that the company is facing. And there are a few reasons for that, but I mean, the first big top line one is just that the buck stops with you. And any legal guidance that goes to the company, you should be willing to put your name on. And that's kind of scary if you have other lawyers that are working hard every day to kind of do the right thing and make the right calls. But I think when business people or other lawyers you work with are coming to you with either rationales or analyses, one of the things I try to do as often as I can is put on that skeptic hat and kick the tires, play the role of my CEO or my CFO, and try to say, hey, like, what are the assumptions underlying this? Why are we doing this? Yeah, this person said that, but did they consider this or did they not consider that? We're all really busy. We have a lot going on. There's nothing more tempting in the world than just pulling up and saying, okay, well, if John at this law firm said that, then that's good enough for me, let's go. But, John works for a lot of clients, and he doesn't work for only your client. You are the expert at your client. You know what the risks of your client are. And I think that's your value add as a GC, is to pressure test the answer, is to find the flaws and tease out the assumptions. And through that process, make sure that it's not only the right answer, but it's the right answer for your client. And I think that your senior leadership is going to demand the same level of rigor from you. So you have to be ready, especially if it's something that they don't want to hear. I want to make sure that if I'm going in to a meeting and I'm going to tell someone that they don't want to hear, that they need to see that I tried really, really hard to get to yes on the question that they want or the answer that they want to hear. And I'm going to do that thing where later I'm going to tell you the exception to this rule. But I think it's a really important exercise, not only for building trust and confidence. It's also an important exercise for just getting the answer right. But that's a really important part of I think what I do every day is, like really trying to play that role. Why are we doing this? And what are the assumptions? And making sure that I'm okay with them and that they add up. I also think that's an important part of making sure that the people you're working with have thought it through. I mean, sometimes, they have, and sometimes maybe they missed this thing that about that they don't know about. So it's not just an adversarial process. It's also a way of, being collaborative and pulling people together and saying, you're making this assumption or you're coming to this conclusion. Let me tell you something that I learned yesterday that you don't know that might change your mind about why, this is the right answer, or, the guidance should be X instead of Y. Okay, so let me just go into some of the questions here and make sure that we're not skipping over anything really germane. One question is about, when stepping into my role, how did I establish a relationship with board members that were there before me? And I think that I'll also answer this question with respect to the C-level, because it's going to be pretty rare that you're going to come into a job at the same time as a whole new group of people and you're going to be starting on equal terms. This goes back to the relationship development. Establishing a relationship is like, the first step of that is really just as easy as picking up the phone and saying, here's who I am and here's what I do. The way I always try to kick it off, and this is sort of in the spirit of a service function, even if it's not necessarily me personally, the way that I think of myself, is offering to be helpful in a very broad, generic sense. I mean it. I really want the legal team at my company to just be on call, to be a problem solver and a helper for the business whenever they need us. And there will be times where we can't really help as much as we'd like to. And there will be times where we say, gee, this isn't really a legal issue, but here's my idea about it. Or we might just say, gee, that's just something that the sales team really has to make a decision on. We can't do that, although, we can sort of sit with you and tell you what the boundary conditions are. But my opener is usually some version of, I want to be helpful, just let me know if there's anything that, that I can do for you or that my team can do. And I think that sets the tone for the entire relationship. Like, it's not a posture where I'm sort of here to throw up roadblocks or to tell people what they can and can't do. It's a facilitator. And I think that's one really powerful model of how a legal team ought to work in a lot of different companies. Okay, so mindful of time, I think we're doing okay. But let me just look to the questions. To keep abreast of all developments in your industry, how do you obtain information on instant regulatory changes that affect your business? So I won't get into kind of some of the other products that are out there. There are companies that kind of sell these, like database solutions. I think one really important thing to just keep in mind is that you're going to have these things flying at you every day. And I think as a legal team and as a GC, you can get into this whack-a-mole type of situation where every time there's some regulatory change, every time there's some bill that's moving through a state house or moving through Congress, your antenna are up. And I think that can be really distracting. We got to know that stuff is happening, and we should be able to pivot when it does. But I think if you focus too much on this stuff, then it could become a real distraction from the day-to-day work. Now, look, there's going to be stuff that's coming down the pike that's going to radically change your business. In health insurance, we track Affordable Care Act developments like every day, like hawks. That's just what we have to do. But there are privacy bills moving in 50 state capitals. It's happening every day. I want to know generally kind of what the trend is, and I want to know when something is going to be enacted and what the effective date is going to be in a state where we do business. But I don't want to sit there every single day and just get bogged down and getting ready for that, because we have enough stuff to comply with today that we need to focus on. So this is not so much an answer to your question about how to keep abreast of it. It's more about sort of thinking about where that slots in the universe of risks. So, not being able to operationalize regulatory changes is a risk. And I think you just need to figure out, based on the nature of the changes, how to take that risk down. And one of them is by, tuning into the big ones and then being aware of the medium-sized ones. And then in the small ones, maybe not even knowing about them until they actually get signed into law. Okay, so let's go to the next one, which is about finding your voice. I think this is, I think I've said this about everyone, but I really mean it about this one, but this is the most important one. And this is in some ways like an encapsulation of the entire sum of the substance here, but it's in some ways, I think, more of just like a guide to you as GC and your persona, and how to slot into the role that has with it a very powerful perch, which can be a little bit new and different if you haven't done it before. And it certainly was for me and still is. And I noticed it on day one, that people react differently when you're the GC than they do if you are not. And that should tell you a little bit about, the responsibility that you have, but also the authority you have. And I want to talk a little bit about how to handle it. So as the GC, you're not just another lawyer. You get to tell people what to do, even if they don't work for you. And that is pretty rare. That's not really the way it works for hardly anyone else in the company. And if they don't listen to what you say, then bad things can happen to them and to the company. So it is a position of immense power and authority. And I think wielding that power in an irresponsible way is the very thing that is going to tarnish your credibility, tarnish your trust, that is going to make it hard to go into the C-suite and give guidance and have people think of you as a trusted person that has their head screwed on straight. So this is just to say that it's easier to wield that authority by virtue of that trust and confidence that you're building than by relying on the parade of horribles that befall people that ignore legal advice. So I want to talk about two things here in this context. One is advice and just reflections about how to become that person who is trustworthy to a fault, that has unimpeachable integrity, and to make that like the North Star of what you do and the work you do every day. And I also want to talk about what it means practically when it comes to actually sitting down and giving guidance to people. So let me talk about the first one first, the big picture stuff. I have on my desktop, my virtual desktop, a list of rules for myself about how I act. And, I add every so often, but it's really only like 7 or 8. And I want to tell you what those rules are, because I think they're really important, maybe in any profession, but certainly for lawyers and certainly for GCs. And anytime I'm going to do something, anytime I want to go and give some guidance, have a meeting, engage in a sticky process, I want to remind myself of what these are. And they are no complaining, no blaming, no gossiping, ever, admitting when you don't know something, acknowledging when someone has changed your mind about something. So not just papering over that you actually, disagreed and now your mind has changed, but admitting that you did that. Having an opinion about hard subjects at the risk of being wrong and not just being someone that prevaricates and on the one hand and on the other. I think you need to have an opinion about the hard decisions that your company's going to make. Admitting when you're wrong. Not trying to be everything to everyone, and then not taking anything personally. I think if you can adhere even halfway to all of these, then you're well on your way. And no one's perfect at all of this. I'm far from perfect, but I think they're really, really important guidelines for how to become a person that is, impeccable, that is totally trusted, that people feel is a person of integrity. So when you walk into a room and you have to tell people something they don't want to hear, that they know that you've done the work and they know that you didn't want to have to do this unless you really had to. And so I mentioned that there was a second thing that was a little bit more practical. And I think this is another powerful tactic. It's less of a strategy and more of a tactic about how to do this job. Lawyers are trained to develop elaborate rationales for guidance and to communicate those in detail. And I think as a junior lawyer, at a law firm or in a company, clients and more senior lawyers really often demand you to show your work and they want to see that level of rigor. I think as a GC, you still need these tools and you still need to be able to go deep and understand where the analysis lives and why it is the way it is. I mentioned that I think that's more of an input than an output. And here's another way in which I mean that. I don't think you need to deploy those explanations and those rationales nearly as often as a GC as you used to. And I think you shouldn't have to. I think it's really important to learn to give those pithy, direct answers without over-explaining. You're the GC. You're not accountable for explaining everything to everyone. Now, you better be ready to, in case you're pushed. And I think that's an important part of it too. You have to be ready to show your work at a moment's notice to prove that you've done it. But it can be very powerful and liberating when someone asks you a question to just say yes, or just say no, or just say yes, but do it this way, but not that way. I think when you're a junior lawyer in a company, it's a really hard thing to do, and you might not be trusted enough to do it. But I think if you're building the trust and credibility in the way that you should be as a GC, then you are going to be able to do that a lot. And people are going to say, great, that's all I needed to know. So that's an exception to what I said before about, being ready to say everything that's on your mind and be able to show your work. And I'll give another exception here, which is that very often clients are going to demand that you show what you know. The way that I try to handle this is by doing it in as simple, easy, plain speak way as I can. And it's sort of like spoon feeding. So if I'm going into a meeting with my CEO to talk about a really thorny issue, what I want to do is say, here's my answer, one layer of explanation, and then I'll go one layer deeper if I need to. And then if I need to go 2 layers deeper, I'll go there. It's not all or nothing. And I think developing a sort of communications model that allows you to do that can be really powerful. It'll save your time and it'll let your client tell you just how much backup they think they need. But hey, if you need to go 5 layers deep, you should be ready to do it. Okay, so there are some questions here. We've made it through most of what I wanted to talk about. And I'll just sort of wrap up on the finding your voice part here that I think, it's going to be a little bit different stylistically for everyone, and you have a different model for what you're good at and how to do your job. But I hope that these things are at least, directionally helpful. And I think that they're common across all of us in the work that we do. Okay, so having gotten through that, let me just address some of the questions here. Agree or disagree, we all work for sales. Interesting question. It depends on your company, right? I would say that, in a B2B SaaS company, that could be some version of yes, where, the engine of the company is the sales team converting leads and upselling clients and taking us from, 25% year-over-year growth to 35% year-over-year growth. And the health of the business will be measured by those numbers. And in that sense, I think as a GC and as a legal function, they are in a lot of ways your most important client. But now I want to sort of tell you why that's not the case. And this sort of gets into, part of what we talked about when it comes to, just being a person of integrity and being the guardian of the company. You have to be ready as the GC to say, G sales team, we're not going to accept that term. That's too much risk. And I know it's too much risk because I know what the risk appetite of our company is. I know it because I know what the strategic goals are. And I know what can go wrong if we start to make compromises on this, that, or the other. So I think we all work for sales in that environment, but I think we work for sales in the same way that any lawyer represents a client, where you have a duty to say to your client, look, this is your choice, but my guidance to you is that you're making a mistake. So I don't think that that means that we are necessarily always servants or that we're always going to just sort of flip over backwards to get to that answer that our client wants. The way in which I don't think that this is true, taking in another context is, in a company like mine, where sales is a really important part about what powers our business. We want to sell insurance products. We certainly measure ourselves according to how many people we sell those to and how much revenue we're generating, just like any company. But there's an enormous number of constituencies in the company that require legal guidance in a highly regulated environment. And every day, I think we're kind of triangulating and balancing. And the sales team might need something from us because it's really important going into a big sales cycle. But we maintain our own list of priorities on the legal side based on what we know about our business, based on what we know about our strategy. And it's not that seldom that we have to say to one team, whether it's our sales team, our product team, or else, that, hey, I know this is really important to you, but we have this other thing that we're working on right now that is more important. And so, we've got to kick this to tomorrow or next week. It's just a matter of managing limited resources. So sure, we all work for sales, some of us more than others, and they're an important constituent, but I think they're always going to be balanced against the other priorities you have and the risks that you're observing as a GC. And, if one person on your team comes to you and says, or I'm sorry, if your VP of sales comes to you as the GC and says, your team is telling me I can't do something, my response to that is, I want to understand it. I want to figure out why, but I'm not choosing sides until I do. And I think equally side with my team as I do with our sales team. Just depends. Okay, so let me just, and I apologize folks for sort of trying to read and talk at the same time on some of these questions. So I want to talk about thoughts or guidance for those who might be acting as a general counsel, solo in-house, for example, but may not have a general counsel title. Any reason we might want or not want the title. I very often see companies that are starting to build a legal team hire a lawyer and call that person the head of legal, or they might call that person, senior counsel or something like that, but not give them the general counsel title. I think for the company, there are some advantages to doing this, and it's more of a kind of, organizational structure, people management tool than it is, saying something about the legal function. And, when I talk to other CEOs about this, people I know that are COOs of other company and are hiring lawyers, one thing I will say to them is very often, if you're not sure who you want to be your GC, then don't give that person the title, because there are plenty of companies that I've also worked with and friends and colleagues that work inside of those companies that have to have hard conversations 2, 3, 4 years down the road with a GC that's not working out because they can't grow into the role. So I think very often it's a way for a company to kind of send a signal to the person they're hiring that, we want you to own this function right now, but we may get to a place in our evolution as a company where you're not the person that we want in that seat. And I think that's eminently fair, as long as both parties know what the sort of the terms are. Is there a reason why you should want it or not want it? I think that getting the GC title, if you're not expected to do GC work, can be hobbling. I think that if you get the title and that's a title that you want, then you should be very clear that general counsel means what it means. It doesn't mean I'm just going to work on corporate commercial stuff, but I'm not going to touch regulatory. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to I'm going to touch regulatory and corporate commercial, but I'm never going to interact with our board, and I'm not going to be engaged in the process of preparing materials for our board meetings. I think general counsel means something to C-level people. I think it means something to a board of directors. And I think you run the risk of people thinking that you're not doing the job because you can't or you don't know how, versus not doing the job because that's just not what's expected of you. And maybe even you've been explicitly told this is not, what you're supposed to be doing or spending your time on. So I think, again, same answer as the first part of the question. You just have to be very clear with your CEO or whoever you're reporting to, that here's what my responsibilities are and ought to look like. And that means that my title is going to be X or my title is going to be Y. So I hope that's a helpful response to that question. But I don't read any particular valence into one or the other. Like if you're heads down completely 100% focused on closing commercial contracts for your client, then if that's a job you've taken and that's a job that you like and you find rewarding, then I don't know why you should be flustered by not being called the general counsel. Although I think it can always be really useful to have an open conversation with your company about what your career ambitions are and spreading your wings and getting more exposure to other parts of the business. Okay. How do you think about providing the legal context to non-lawyers in the business and educating them about legal constraints so they can make better decisions? Great question. And this gets into one of the really important functions of one of the important tasks of a legal function, and maybe even the GC. We didn't break down, and I didn't really go through the kind of GC sort of work models, like, there's sort of the catalyst, the operator, the guardian. You can find all that stuff online, and there's some really good, useful knowledge in there about this. But one of those, and one of the models, or at least one of the things that informs the work that I think a GC ought to be doing, is trying to bring the company along to your vision about what the boundary conditions of the law are. And I think especially in a small high growth company where you might be trying to disrupt an industry, you might be working with a lot of people that came to your industry from another industry and they never worked inside it. And they're going to rely on you to tell them what the rules of the road are. I think you need to be prepared to take them through that and to help them understand like the structural constraints around what it is that you do. And at my company, this happens all the time because health insurance is highly regulated. It's regulated at the state and federal level. Sometimes it's regulated by more than one regulator at the state level. And if you're coming in to my company from the outside, from financial services or from a consulting firm, or even as a lawyer from a law firm that's going to be doing corporate and commercial work, it's really helpful to have someone say, hey, here's the world we inhabit, here's the world we live in, and here's generally how it works. I feel, privileged to have learned from other lawyer colleagues of mine about what those rules are. And I do that every day from other lawyers on my team. So when it comes to the business itself, I think critically important. It's a two-way street. I mentioned before that you can learn a lot from your sales team about what the market conditions are like. And I think that they can learn from you about what types of For us, broker compensation schemes are permitted under state law. And it doesn't have to be granular. It doesn't have to be, well, this statute says this. It can be, look, generally speaking, you're allowed to do this, and generally speaking, you're not allowed to do that. So keep that in mind. But if you get into a sticky situation or you're not really sure whether you're over the line, let's have another conversation. I think you should be prepared to operate at that level. You might not need to do that for your CEO, and you probably shouldn't have to go there all the time and unless you're invited to. But you can do this informally in the way I just mentioned, or you can do it formally and say, hey, like I want to do a training for the sales team on this stuff. In compliance world, I think that's something that's often required. Bring people in and saying, here's what privacy law requires us to do and not do. And I need everyone to certify that they read this and they took this training. So really important function. I think that you can bake this into the risk agenda that I talked about. If you're seeing operational problems crop up, due to a particular group or team or just company-wide lack of understanding about the way a particular legal framework operates, then you can say, gee, I think it's time for a training on that. And I want these people to be in there, and I want it to be required for this team. And then you can go to your COO or your CEO and you can say, I want everyone from this level down or from this level up to go to this training, and I want your support to make it happen. So answering this question by going back to different parts of the presentation, I think that's a really important part of the job. So what advice would you give to an associate GC looking to grow into the GC role down the road? What are the most important skills to develop early on? And I said at the beginning, well, we're not going to talk about how to get the job, but it is important, and I think it's worth a couple minutes. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to do this and maybe take one more. A lot of the things that I talked about are things that at a sort of vanilla level, you as an associate GC can start to deploy, or at least start to think about, how would I do this if I were the GC? If I were the person in the chair right now and the buck stopped with me, how would I approach this problem? One thing that we do at Oscar a lot is, we have like a very detailed, it's not really so much a checklist, but it's more like a sort of cheat sheet on answering legal questions. And it gets into a lot of the stuff we talked about, like what do our competitors do? What's the regulatory fines for violations of this type? The list goes on and on. Those are things that I'm thinking about every time I answer a question, and I want all the lawyers on my team to be going through the same exercise. And so getting into that mindset about like, what would you do if the responsibility rested with you is just a good mental framework to be in. As far as like the most important skills, I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily say skills, because I think the experience and just doing your job every day is going to get you there. If you don't have a lot of resources where you work, learn from your colleagues in other companies, learn from outside counsel. The stuff that we're talking about right now, like these types of presentations, really, really good way to figure out how to get on that trajectory. So I said, I don't necessarily think they're skills. So what should you be trying to do, and what should you be developing? So I think it's a frame of mind that invites new challenges and new work, that invites really hard problems. I think you should completely be in a mindset where you really want to be the person that the business comes to whenever there's something sticky, because you're reliable and trustworthy and you can tease it out, and you want to get, in the thick of it with the sales team, the product team, to try to disentangle a hard problem. I mentioned legal analysis is the input and not the output. So think of your job as less about doing legal analysis and more about problem solving using legal analysis. So this will require you in a meeting, in a group of people, to kind of like, take off your lawyer hat, or at least kind of adjust it, and not limit yourself to just saying, well, the boundaries are here and here, which means that here's the space in between, but that's a business question. I think that you can afford to say, gee, yeah, it's a business question, but we have option A, B, and C. I've thought through the pros and cons, and option B makes the most sense to me. And it makes the most sense to me because here's what, as a company, we have on our list of strategic priorities, and this just dovetails best with it with the least amount of risk. I think learning to have that conversation as an assistant or associate GC will kind of paint you as someone that's trying to level up and is doing it. So I know we have 3 minutes left, and I will sort of look at Rod and ask him whether I can keep going, because I don't want to interrupt any sort of closing remarks that he or Hannah might have. But as you can probably tell, I'm good at rambling on.
No, it's great. I love the content, and it's great to see everybody ask so many questions. It's up to you if you want to answer just one more, if and I can just kind of conclude it there, or we can sort of conclude it here and move all the questions to the online community afterwards. It's up to you.
Yeah, let me add, let's just take one or maybe two if we can do it before the top of the hour, because
Yeah,
I think the questions are really great.
yeah, let's do it.
So one question is, usually the CEO gravitates towards, CFO's views as they work really closely. What's the key to establishing a good working relationship with the CFO? So as the GC, I've worked with two different CFOs, and they have very different styles. Neither good nor bad, just different in the same way that two lawyers might approach problems differently. And so I'll just go back to something I mentioned before, which is the relationship, like develop that relationship of trust. Understanding what the incentives, what the concerns, what the big ticket problems that your CFO is looking to address or solve is going to give you 80% of the answer to how to develop this good working relationship. You might find that your CFO is an expert in the industry, knows as much about the sort of regulatory landscape as you do as the lawyer, feels very comfortable operating within it, might even be a source of information for you about some of that raw material for legal analysis. In which case, I think a lot of times you're not necessarily going to be leaned upon quite as much to sort of be more of a pure lawyer, and you can be liberated to have more of a business type relationship, or sort of develop more, bring more risks to your CFO that are not just sort of right in the heart of the regulatory expertise or commercial expertise that he or she has. Conversely, if you have a CFO that is like joining a new industry and gee, this is all Greek to me, and I'm not really sure how to make heads or tails of it, then I think one of the most important functions that the GC can bring to the CFO is being someone that's like buddy, really close, really tight, font of information and sort of risk guidance about whether this is sort of big, medium, or small. I think that CFOs that are in that situation will very often gravitate towards the GC and say, I heard this thing that really scares me. Should I be scared? Or should I not? Is this something that I'm going to have to worry about going into, our disclosures when we file our, 10Q, or, is this something that doesn't even hit the radar screen? And then when you're interacting, working with a CFO like that, you'll find that, oh, gee, this is the kind of thing that if my CFO knew about, he might be asking me this question. I'm going to go to him or her preemptively and say, hey, there's this thing that's happening. Just want you to know, this is a medium risk. I'm on top of it. I'm working with this group of people. We'll get back to you and let you know, what we learn. I think that's a really powerful way of showing, what you do and how you do it to someone that might be, not quite as acclimated to the industry you work in. And so we're at 4 o'clock, and so I'll stop there, and unless Rod wants me to drone on.
Yeah, let's put it there, since we're reaching the top of the hour. Wow, Hank, that was amazing. So informative, so thoughtful. You are definitely a master presenter and question answer. I loved how you handle all that. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know how busy you are, but you truly made our first GC workshop really special. So appreciate that. And thank you also to the 100+ attendees that joined, and for those that stayed all the way till the end. This is our biggest event to date, and it was really amazing to see everyone engage and ask questions and really sort of be really engaged in this event. And I learned a lot, and I'm sure you guys all did as well. So we do these kinds of things every month. So if you guys want to stay in the loop, feel free to sign up for our newsletter, which is at newsletter.lawtrades.com. We'll also be publishing this video as well as the workshop notes on that newsletter as well, probably by the end of the week or early next week. So definitely check that out. Of course, if you're looking to work with any flexible legal talent, you know where to go, lawtrades.com, create a position, and we'll sort of take it from there. And lastly, I know there's a lot of questions here that went unanswered. We also run a private online community of GCs where they can connect with each other and continue the conversation. So if you are a GC or an AGC and you'd like an invite, feel free to just shoot me an email, rod@lawtrades.com. That's RAAD @lawtrades.com. And I'll be sure to sort of invite you there, and you can sort of post your questions there, and Hank will invite you, Hank, as well, to go in there. So yeah, so let's leave it as that. Thank you again. Thank you, Hank. Thank you to all our attendees. Thanks, Hannah, for all your help, and we'll see you guys at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.